Introducing Dawn Porter. Dawn, you gave a really engaging keynote speech at MIPDOC, MIP TV in Cannes a few weeks ago, and you reminded me of just what a fantastic career you had. I remember I was working as a consultant at A&E 12, 13, 14 years ago, and you were a senior executive. You were clearly on your way to the very top, and you confessed that you were leaving A&E to set up a production company. And I remember responding that I was also going to set up a newsletter. So I've really followed your career with huge interest since then. And I notice you've produced, what, 18, 20 films
22.
in this short period, 22 films. It's incredible. You're a Sundance finalist twice. You've won many other awards, all deserved. So I thought we'd catch up today. So it's great to have you on our documentary business webcast. Thanks, Dawn.
Thanks. It's great to catch up with you. And I will say, something I've always admired is your entrepreneurial spirit and just general positivity and honesty. So I'm very glad that here all these years later, we are still friends.
Well, thanks, Dawn. We've got a mutual admiration society, but you're the one with the real accomplishments, I can promise you. So, Dawn, I want to back up and say, when I first met you at A&E, you confessed at the time you described that you were related to Paul Robeson. And Paul Robeson was an inspiration to me as a young guy in Australia who was really interested in civil rights, because he was also a great athlete, and I was an athlete too, not anywhere near at the same level. And he really suffered for his beliefs. He was banned at his university. His record was struck from the pages there. And I'm going to share a clip right now of Paul Robeson visiting the Sydney Opera House when it was under construction. And so after that, Dawn, did his life, his membership of your family, did he help set your career?
I think so. I mean, in our family, he's known as Uncle Paul because he was my grandmother's uncle. But she was quite, so he is brothers. He is the youngest brother of my great grandfather, Ben Robeson. And my great grandfather, I actually live now a block and a half away from the church that my great grandfather was the pastor of. It's a very large AME, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And one of the things, kind of one of the treasured possessions I have is a sermon by my great grandfather, and it was called My Brother Paul, and it was about when they realized that he could sing. But it's a very, very important part of our family that whenever Uncle Paul was kind of really being chastised or being discriminated against, he always had this church home of people who supported him. And so something that they did quite regularly is, he would sing there, or he would host political events there. And so my entire family really kind of the giving voice to weaker people has always been kind of a central tenet, kind of a backbone of the family. And I also think he was such a gifted everything. I mean, he was a letter in multiple sports. He was a lawyer, Columbia lawyer, like to go to Columbia in that time. And then a Broadway actor, a stage and screen actor, and then to have such a prominent role in the civil rights movement. He spoke multiple languages. He used to entertain my mother and her brothers by speaking to them in foreign languages. And so there was just kind of this idea that you really could be anything, because he was an example of a man who was so much and also really, really loved his family. So I think, there is that Robeson kind of spirit.
That's a really great story. But Don, you could also be hounded out of the country, pursued, have your civil rights cancelled. It could go the wrong way.
Well, one of the things, that is really seared into the memory of my family is when his passport was revoked. And that was in the 1950s. And then he really was, broken by the United States government. But I think you can, what I took from that is, they don't go after you that hard if you're not powerful and if you're not making a difference. And so while his personal life ended, rather tragically, I mean, he really, one of the last pictures of him is holding me as a baby. My mother took
Holding you?
holding me. My mother took me when I was born. One of her first trips was to go see him. He was living with his sister Marion, who my grandmother is named for. And so you can see, showing him the next generations were coming was so important. So you know that to me said, this man made such a huge difference in the world. And while he suffered for it, I think he was mostly proud because of it.
Yeah, it's really great. It's fantastic hearing that, Dawn. I've never heard that story, and I just think the clip that I'm showing in this webinar of him serenading Australian workers who were just engrossed by his personality, his performance, and his vocalization kind of speaks to this enormous power that he had of personality and artistry. So happy that he inspired you too. And so let's come to you now. Which of your films would you say he most inspired? Haven't really prepared that question, but there you go.
Oh, I think, I think all of my films speak to each other. I think that you might not see the direct connection, but if you pay attention, they're all in conversation. So I think certainly John Lewis. John Lewis was, it was a highlight of my life to spend a year traveling with Mr. Lewis, around
Yeah.
the country, and to go to his home and meet his siblings. And one of the things that stood out for me in making that film is more than one person who worked with him would say John Lewis was a very quiet person in person, that he was always pushed to the front because he exuded this calm and this sense of, right. But also, John Lewis was never trying to step in front of anybody else. He was always lifting other people up. So I definitely think of that with Uncle Paul's, kind of commitment to the labor movement was so important to him. And that was about lifting up an entire group of people, not any one person, but also not about putting yourself, sacrificing his passport. He could have made a lot of different choices, Uncle Paul, and been very wealthy. He was very wealthy for, a long time. And instead, he made choices to use his fame for other people. And I definitely see that in John Lewis. I see that, though, in Lady Bird, in Lady Bird Johnson, who, was actually quite the power behind the throne in so many ways. And, kind of approached her job, because that's what it is. The First Lady position is a job. And she approached that job with an idea of, how can I help the most people with the platform that I have? And I think that very directly speaks to a Robeson mentality. So
It's a beautiful film, the Lady Bird film, and I guess in that case you're shifting to the kind of the unspoken for woman rather than the unspoken for working class or
well,
no.
I think Lady Bird, Lady Bird comes from East Texas. She does not come from wealth and so, she often would say it's a job she never auditioned for. She never imagined that she would have. And, one of the
She married a
things,
teacher, right? At the
well,
time, wasn't he a high school teacher?
I don't, we weren't focused on the president. So, um, but what Lady Bird did, which is what so many women do, is and also like kind of what a John Lewis does. It's so many of the people she's looking for, where can I help? you know, what can I do? And so she you know, pressures Johnson to essentially create the East Wing. She insisted that he pay her staff, and she hired all women. So she hired Liz Carpenter as her press person. She invited female reporters into the White House and gave them access to her, the inner workings. And then she does something. She's the first lady to go on a sanctioned campaign swing through multiple states alone. And she does that. And he sends her, you know, much like we're seeing Kamala Harris go out you know, Kamala Harris is now talking about the most important issues probably to President Biden in terms of re-election. She's talking about abortion and women's rights. She's talking about getting the youth vote, the Black vote, the minority vote. She's talking about, you know, a lot of kind of the central things. And Lady Bird was doing that too. When Johnson needs to keep the South, you know, but he's angered them by supporting civil rights, he sends his wife into the Deep South on this whistle stop tour. And so, you know, it's really remarkable when you think of what she had never done that before, and yet she did it, and he does keep the South.
So as well as the story, the making of the film fascinated me because you discovered or licensed her audio diary, or, you know, how did that film come together? I think it's a great story.
Yeah. So the Julia Schweig is an author, and she discovered Lady Bird's tapes while she was doing research. And so she is the first. She presented to the Ford Foundation. They funded her to write a book based on Lady Bird's diaries. Then that became a podcast with ABC News, Hulu. And then after the podcast, ABC called me up. They knew that I was interested in this time period. And so they, you know, Jackie Glover, who's a spectacular executive at HBO for more than 27 years. She was then working for ABC, and she said, "Do you think this could be a movie?" And I said, "Well, let's see." So we started, you know, researching, because of course the thing that's different in a book or a podcast is you have to have something to see. So I said, "What are we going to see of Lady Bird?" And we started doing the archival research. And when we first just put in her name, which is what you do when you start archival research online, and not that much came back.
Really?
And so when we put Lady Bird Johnson, then we put Mrs. Johnson, you know, a little bit more. President's wife, no name, President's wife for the date range, more came. And, you know, from working on the John Lewis movie, from working on a Bobby Kennedy series, 4-hour series for Netflix, I knew that there was a lot of footage from this period. And so we realized we were going to have to look harder to find archival footage of the First Lady of the United States during Johnson's administration. And so the person who became our guide is Lady Bird herself. She was a magnificent reporter. She had a journalism degree from the University of Texas. And she would note which reporters were at certain speeches. And so instead of, you know, so we looked to her notes to say, okay, Nancy Dickerson from NBC News was at this speech on that day. So then we went back to NBC and said, can we have the footage from that day without mentioning Lady Bird? And there she was. And so, you know, I'd always wanted to do an all archival film with no talking heads and kind of treat it like I'd shot it like verite film.
Yeah, it's one of
so
my favorite genres too, Dawn, and we've covered Tom Jennings' work, and he's won numerous awards for that style too. I just love it.
Yeah. And then, you know, Lady Bird with her diary, she solves what can be the problem with the all archival is sometimes you need a narrator. And so Lady Bird narrates her film, but that film is particularly well suited to that style because it's not meant to be the definitive, not that there is such a thing, but it's not meant to be the only take on this period. It's meant to be what she saw and what she wanted to express. And so we just gave, you know, we put pictures to her words. And it's really a testament to what a spectacular reporter she is, that when we found the images, they really matched her words. And so it's as if she's watching the archive that she didn't even know about. She hadn't even seen. And yet she's able to narrate the film for us. So that was a very satisfying process.
Excuse me, her narration is really heartfelt. You're really drawn to it the moment you hear her
Yeah,
voice,
she recorded 123 hours of audio
Wow.
tapes. And so we had to kind of narrow down, of course, you know, and that's what you do with any film. You pick your themes. And so
Yeah.
we, you know, narrowed the themes down. And if you're the director, if you're me, you get to pick them. So it's all things that I'm interested in. So it was a really fun movie to work on.
It all began so beautiful.
Lyndon Johnson and Mrs. Johnson have just arrived.
Lyndon and I rode down the avenue in one car. Suddenly, there was a shot. I heard the words, "The president is dead." Mrs. Kennedy's dress was stained with her husband's blood. I asked her if I couldn't get somebody to help her change. She says, "Oh no, I want them to see what they have done to Jack."
We have this from Washington.
Commentator was saying, Lyndon Johnson, now President of the United States. That was when the enormity first struck me.
I was walking onto a stage for a part I had never rehearsed. As the wife of the president, only I would see events unfold from that particular vantage point. I ought to record this, and it was incredible.
I walked to the on hand, whatever he's doing.
You want to listen to my critique?
Yes, ma'am.
You were a little restless. You need to read it with a little more conviction. In general, it was a good B+.
Lindbergh came flying into my room. Mama, Dr. King's been shot. Evening assumed a nightmare quality. The White House was like a fortress. Nobody gets out, nobody gets in. The phone jarred me awake. It was Lyndon saying Senator Kennedy had been shot. What is our country coming to? What is happening to us? Are we a sick society? The world had changed overnight, but Vietnam dominated the news. He, I, and the children, Linda and Lucy, will be criticized and slandered for things we have done, things we never did at all.
That Vietnam War is for the birds. Linda Bird, Lady Bird, Lou Bird.
This will be painful. It's a perilous path to tread. The burial of Bobby Kennedy. I found myself in front of Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. I felt extreme hostility. Was it because I was alive? The greatest courage in the world is to get up in the morning and go about the day's work. It is an endurance contest, this job. That's a large order for a woman.
I want to compliment you on the trailer too. It's a really gripping trailer with her personality shining through these horrible events, assassinations. And
I can't take credit for that at all, but I will mention, like, when I used to work at ABC News, you know, from 1998 to 2005, I worked at ABC News, and he was there when I was there. So, you know, there is something to having a pro kind of in the seat to really know how to lean into the footage and show just how gorgeous her narration is and how evocative it is and how it can be really gripping and really carry the film.
Oh, it sure worked. So moving on, that was a commission by ABC. So they thought, this is a great idea. Who's going to make it? Let's call Dawn. What about your recent project, which was a Sundance finalist? And then you moved into the music genre, big leap.
Yeah.
What was the story? How did that come about?
Yeah, that's also a commission from Sony Pictures. It's, well, Sony Music. And so Sony Music is really doing a deep dive into their catalog. They have all of these artists, but even more important for filmmakers is they own so much of the music. And so, you know, so for so many music films, they're too expensive to make because we can't afford to license the music. I mean, you think of like great film about Sinead O'Connor, but it's so terrible that she can't sing Nothing Compares, you know, which is like an iconic song for her because it's a Prince song. So, you know, what attracted me to this was all the access to all the archival they had. They had rehearsal footage as well as like his music catalog. He had done all these interviews for press tours for Sony, and they had all of those. So, kind of how I mentioned like the films speak to each other. Well, you might not put Lady Bird Johnson and Luther Vandross together, but I do, because like making the Lady Bird film, I was like, oh, Luther should tell his story. We added some other voices in, but with access to his lyrics tell a story. He writes all those songs. And so if you listen and you give yourself the freedom to like stay in it for a while, you can really learn a lot about him. And so that's what we did.
And it is a wonderful film. And I had questions about distribution, because Sony commissioned the film and it's in their interests. It could be seen as a promotional film. Does that limit its distribution potential, say with public broadcasters or any other platforms?
Well, it would if it was a promotional film, but it's not. But that's always a concern. You have to be careful about who's funding your projects. So here I had Final Cut, so that wasn't a worry. Public broadcasting, interestingly, did express some interest in the film. They wanted to, kind of get in the mix, and did come back to us with, you'd have to make, some changes, some credit changes, etc. But otherwise they didn't have trouble with it. I think the bigger thing is, what's unique about Sony is they don't have a streamer attached to them. They sell to everybody. So this is something that you could do with a Sony, where it might be more limited if you were with, a Universal Music, for example, might need to go to Universal Pictures or part of the NBC family. I don't know that, but that could be a limitation. Sony's is in a very unique position of just, they're open for all business.
We talk about that. They're the arms dealer and not a platform. They're free to sell to everybody, which gives them a lot of freedom, and they avoided a potentially catastrophic risk in investing in the streaming
It also
platform.
means they have more money, because they're not trying to support a streaming platform, which, we all see like how difficult that is to compete with, feed that beast.
So Dawn, I could really talk to you for a long time about each of these films, and but what are you working on now? Why don't we finish on that note?
I am working on a film based on a book, Winnie and Nelson, about Winnie and Nelson Mandela. And so there are many projects about Nelson Mandela, but not so many about his wife, who was the person actually who was out of prison while he was in jail for 27 years. And really the story of their marriage is so intertwined with the freedom struggle in South Africa. And they're both much more complicated people than they're really portrayed to be. So there's so many things that are fascinating about their marriage and their partnership. But one is, he was being recorded, he was being spied on. So they would write these letters, but they knew that the South African apartheid government was reading them. So they're always writing in code. And so when you think about what filmmakers and historians, what we're trying to do is to understand based on what the writings are, but what do you do when they're all in code? What's actually to be believed? What's actually true? So what the book, we've optioned this book, Winnie and Nelson, Portrait of a Marriage, and it really does allow you to bring some context in. The South Africa struggle starts is really taking off before the United States civil rights struggle. It's very influenced by the African nationalist struggle. So it's really a fascinating, and then, they're people. So Winnie was much more open and called for armed resistance. And even as her husband is trying to negotiate a peaceful exchange of power. And so these two just giant personalities. I mean, it was a real clash of two titans, not just one. And so that's what the story that the film will tell.
I can't wait to see that. I'm going to add a little personal comment here that I think the only time that in my life where I've been to a location where I was touched by spiritual greatness, like huge spiritual power, was visiting Robben Island. I've been there twice, and I stood outside the very cell that I think Mandela was in for, I don't know, that time, 19 years, just saying no every time he was approached for a settlement. And that's the closest I think I've ever been to being touched by greatness. I'm repeating myself, but that's a really great story you're pursuing.
Yeah, it's an epic story. And I think, this is, we were able to start this with funds from the Howard Schultz Foundation. And, Howard Schultz, former CEO of Starbucks, founder of Starbucks. And Howard's really interested in leadership stories, and I think these days, as we see how complex the world is, I think we need to understand really what leadership is, but also the sacrifices.
Yep.
It's not enough to have a person who's a myth. And right now there's a lot of myth about both Mandelas. And so we're going to try and get as close as we can to what actually is happening. So
that's really
the hope
fascinating.
anyway.
Well, telling the story of marriage is such a fresh way of approaching his life. Let's call it quits there. Dawn, your company is Trilogy Films, great website, and you can read all about you, your career, your upcoming projects, past projects, and our little webinar here will be on documentary business. And really appreciate you joining us. Fascinating story, and I loved coming back to the construction of the Sydney Opera House as a start.
It's certainly unique, but it's great to be here with you.
Thanks a lot, Dawn. See ya.
Thanks. Take care.